All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to tonight's Alexandria Historical Society history event. My name is Scott Vierk, and I'm on the board of the Alexandria Historical Society. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Alexandria Historical Society is a nonprofit educational organization dedicated to the research and study of Alexandria and Northern Virginia history. We host lectures and special events throughout the year. We also publish a journal, the Alexandria Chronicle, that features scholarly articles by local historians. We also issue grants for the study, preservation, and interpretation of local history, and we do an annual history awards. If you're interested in joining the society and supporting our work, please visit our website, and we'll have more information about membership at the end of the talk tonight. So before we get started with tonight's presentation, a couple quick housekeeping rules. We are going to be doing a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So when we get to the Q&A portion, you're going to put your questions in the chat, and then I will read it to our special guest tonight. No need to put your video screen on, no need to unmute yourself. So you can keep all of that off. That way, if you want to make funny faces at me, you can do that and no one will know. So with the housekeeping out of the way, let's get down to business. Our guest tonight is a local public historian whose research focuses on public memory, family ties, and grief. She has been working at historic sites for over a decade at this point, and her work has appeared in Time, the New York Times, and C-SPAN. She was awarded the Scott Hartwig Public History Fellowship at the Civil War Institute in 2015 and the America 250 Commendation Medal in 2024. She is currently the Senior Manager of Public Programs and Interpretation at Woodlawn and Pope-Leighey House and is currently working towards completing her Master's of Arts in American History from Gettysburg College. Her first book, Marquis de Lafayette Returns, there we go. A Tour of America's National Capital Region was published by the History Press in 2024. So please join me in welcoming one of the experts on America's fighting Frenchmen, Elizabeth Reese.
Thank you, Scott. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the Alexandria Historical Society for having me speak with all of you tonight. As someone who lives in Alexandria, it's an extra special honor, so I'm grateful for that. As Scott mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Reese, and I am a public historian who specializes in family ties, grief, and public memory. And definitely tonight, the lecture will be a little bit more focused on the public memory side of things. So Lafayette, he's kind of been a little bit of a ghost in my career. He's followed me around from historic site that I've worked at. But the real inspiration for me to want to write this book about Lafayette's national tour came from living in Alexandria, my own living in Alexandria, and his own ties to this town. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share this with you tonight. Tonight's talk is going to be a little bit more, if you've heard me talk about Lafayette and Alexandria before, tonight's talk is going to be a little bit different. It's a little bit more focused on his winter in 1824, 1825, kind of the first half of 1825, really, because during this time, he spent the majority of the time of his tour during this time period right here in the DC area, which included the city of Alexandria. So the Marquis de Lafayette returned to America for the first time in 40 years in August of 1824. It was originally meant to be a 4-month tour, and he ended up staying for 13 months. He was here until early September of 1825. During this time period, he visited all 24 states, or there were 24 states at the time. He traveled over 6,000 miles, and he was greeted by millions and millions of Americans. The very first arrival into America for the first time that he had been back in 40 years happened in the middle of August 15th, 1824, arriving on Staten Island. He then had a very huge, more public reception. The very next day, he sailed across New York Harbor and had a reception at Castle Clinton, which is depicted in this mid-19th century depiction of the event here on the screen. At Castle Clinton, there were about 50,000 people who had lined the streets to welcome Lafayette. And to put that into perspective, the population of New York City at the time was 150,000. So you have about a third of the entire population of New York, just at the southern tip of Manhattan, waiting to greet Lafayette. So the demand for Lafayette was like nothing that most Americans had ever seen at that time period. The New York Mirror and Ladies Literary Gazette writes about how this kind of Lafayette fever enraptured the nation shortly after his arrival. And they wrote that, quote, "Gentlemen are ready to throw by their business to shake him by the hand, and ladies forget their lovers to dream of him. If a man asks, 'Have you seen him?' you know who he means." So Lafayette really had this unique grip on the nation. This turnout would have really been impressive if it was just for like Lafayette's first arrival. It's the first city that he's in for the first time in quite a few decades. But what was really remarkable about Lafayette's tour is that this scene, as it was kind of depicted and described in New York City, would be replayed almost every single day of Lafayette's tour. Large cities, small cities, even towns that Lafayette is passing through would replicate the pageantry of appreciation that New York had. Because really, wherever Lafayette was in America for these 13 months, the crowds were going to follow. What is really, really special is that Lafayette's tour is one of the first documented cases of tourism, at least on such a massive scale in early America. When you think about travel during this time period, how are people getting around? Kind of what is there's really no such thing as like leisure tourism as we think of today. Even for us traveling to places like Richmond that are relatively close by, we don't really think much of it. Most people in early America in the early 19th century would have never traveled farther than the county in which they lived in. So what we see with Lafayette coming is that people are traveling outside of their homes. And the way we know this is that frequently in the crowds that were gathered waiting for Lafayette, the recorded number of people that were there outnumbered the recorded population at the time. So it's showing that people are packing up temporarily, not moving permanently, but traveling for an event, which had never really happened before. We also see this in the winter of 1824 and into 1825 when Lafayette decides that he's going to stay in Washington, D.C. For that time period. Temporary lodging and boarding houses and taverns saw maximum capacity at an otherwise quiet time during the city, which indicates that the public had this really desire to be near him. They wanted to see him, and they knew he was staying put in DC for an extended period of time, and so they were going to travel to Washington with the hopes of seeing him. So really, what made Lafayette so special? And who was he as a man that inspired all these millions of Americans to want to travel to see him? Lafayette was a French noble who fought for American freedom during the War of Independence and the American Revolution. And a lot of French nobles were kind of coming over here and looking for title and payment. But what makes Lafayette really unique is that he says in his own words that he is here to learn and not teach. He does become a major general. He is the youngest major general in the American Revolution, and he becomes the only foreign military officer he fought for under the Continental Army, but as a Frenchman, commanded American troops. He also donates his about $200,000 of his own money to fund the war. And he really felt impassioned by the ideas of human liberty and equality. This is sparked when he first hears about what's going on in the American colonies when he's a teenager. And then when he's a slightly older teenager, 19, he decides that he's going to come over and assist the cause himself. Another thing that makes Lafayette really unique is that he had a very close personal relationship with George Washington. Washington is kind of even today, we kind of see him as this kind of stoic figure. Lafayette had a close relationship with him where it could kind of like break down that exterior that Washington had. And this is because Washington saw Lafayette as kind of a son-like figure, and in turn, Lafayette, who was orphaned by the age of 12, really saw Washington as a father figure and really the man he wanted to emulate for the rest of his life. He really viewed Washington above all others, and the two men had a very close relationship that way. After the American Revolution, Lafayette returns to France. He does come back to America for a pretty brief time. In 1784, he returns for a 4-month tour that would kind of be the precursor to the 1824-1825 tour. I mentioned that the tour originally in 1824 was only supposed to last 4 months. It was supposed to kind of be exactly what he did 40 years before. But what ended up happening when he came back in the 1820s is that more and more people wanted to see him. And so that travel itinerary got a little bit longer and longer. But when Lafayette returns to America finally in 1824, he does not look like this dashing military hero that we see on the screen in front of us. He's going to look a little bit different. This is the Lafayette that Americans saw in 1824. He's a little bit older. He's walking with a cane, which you can see here in this portrait. I also, no offense to him, but I do like to mention he's also wearing a toupee in this. He also was very concerned about how he was being perceived. So a lot has changed in his life in between these two periods. One big thing that's happening in this time period is the French Revolution. When Lafayette returned to France, he kind of had these expectations that what he had learned fighting for American independence would help bring about these ideas of liberty and equality back to his home country. The French Revolution is a little bit different than the American Revolution. What happens and what is one of the causes of the French Revolution is actually the French monetary support of the war for American independence. It really depletes France's finances, and it drives these really divisive divisions between the class systems in France. You had the French nobles, who were like the highest of the classes, the French royals, the highest of the class systems, the French nobles, which Lafayette was a member of, and then everywhere else was the common people. So it's kind of this power imbalance that's happening in France at the time. Lafayette was a member of the noble class, and he also supported the idea of a monarchy in France, but he was hopeful that France would evolve to a constitutional monarchy where the people had balanced representation, and it's not just the monarch who is kind of saying what goes. As the terror in France rises, this is a pretty unpopular opinion, and Lafayette finds himself really torn between two sides. He recognizes that the blade of the guillotine is likely going to be his fate if he remains in France, and so he attempts to flee with the hopes of arriving in America, but what ends up happening is that Lafayette is imprisoned for 5 years between Prussia and Austria from 1792 to 1797. Most of this time period was spent in solitary confinement. We can really say that his life was saved because his wife, Adrienne, who was also imprisoned, she was actually scheduled for execution, and her life was spared the day before that execution was scheduled. She finds out her husband's imprisoned. She goes to Austria to meet with officials there, asks for him to be freed. They say no, and so she voluntarily asks to be imprisoned with him, and not only her, but also their 2 daughters joined them as well. So this act of the family together is what Lafayette kind of counts as what's saving his life during this time period. And then so when he is released from prison in 1797, he kind of pulls back from politics a little bit. He takes care of his wife. Adrienne's health suffered in the prison in Olmütz where they were. And after her death, he kind of like comes back into the scene, at least in France. He remains, though, very much beloved in America. So in 1824, when America is on the cusp of celebrating their 50th anniversary celebrations, and he gets this invitation from President Monroe at the time, asking if he would like to come to America, Lafayette agrees. I like to put these two images side by side because you can really see the difference. They're also kind of very similar poses. They're a little bit just a mirror imaged. So it kind of shows the difference in like how Americans really remembered Lafayette and then the man who came 40 years later and who they greeted. The 50th birthday celebrations was the really main cause of what brought Lafayette back to America. At the time, America was pretty bitterly divided and politically. After the War of 1812, one of the main things that comes out of the War of 1812 is the sense of American identity. Americans start seeing themselves as Americans. They're not seeing themselves just as Virginians, as New Yorkers, and as Pennsylvanians, but they start collectively seeing themselves as Americans. They do not, however, agree on what it means to be an American. And so there are these like rumblings of divisions that are happening, but Monroe sees this unity that comes out of the War of 1812, and he really wants to continue it. He views political parties as the source of division in the country, so he chooses to ignore political parties. What happens if you have a wound that's kind of festering and you choose to ignore it? It's going to get worse. And that's really what happens during Monroe's presidency, is that these giant divisions are starting to happen in the country. So his balm, Monroe's balm for this division that's happening, is to invite Lafayette. Lafayette is the last surviving major general of the American Revolution. He is universally beloved and adored by the Americans. And if that's not enough to bring people together, kind of what does? So that is what is bringing Lafayette back. On Lafayette's side, Lafayette was not very well liked in France at this time period. He had always wanted to come back to America, and so he was kind of looking for this change of pace. So why did I focus on Washington, D.C., besides the fact that I live in this area? But D.C. was a really unique place for Lafayette. When he arrived in 1824, Washington, D.C. did not exist in any of his prior visits, but it was the physical embodiment of what they had fought for during the American Revolution. And it also held the namesake of George Washington, the man that he kind of, again, adored above all else. The Capitol building also was completed for Lafayette's arrival. This image is of the west front of the Capitol in 1824. So this is what Lafayette would have seen. This is the side that faces what's the National Mall today. And you might notice it looks a little bit different than how we're used to seeing the Capitol these days. It's a lot smaller, and the dome is a lot shorter. The first original dome that we see here was made of wood and copper, and it was about half the height of the Capitol dome that we see today. The building expands over time. They build a new House and Senate chamber in the 1850s, and they build a new dome around that time period as well. But the floor of the rotunda today and the walls just below the cast iron dome, that's the original sandstone that Lafayette would have seen and stood on as well. So it was completed in time for his return. One of the reasons it had to be completed is because just 10 years prior, the Capitol and the White House were both burned during the War of 1812. So there was kind of like a good deadline for Lafayette's arrival, celebrate his return, and also have the building completed from the damage that has happened. But the larger reason that I focused my research on Lafayette's time in DC is because he spent about a third of his entire tour in Washington, DC, and that included time in Alexandria as well. Because in 1824, Alexandria was part of Washington, D.C. You can see this outlined in the District of Columbia. This is an 1835 map, and if you look at the bottom of the diamond, there is Alexandria right there. There are still a few remnants of D.C. and Alexandria today. There's a couple downspouts that still say Alexandria, D.C., and of course we have some boundary stones here in the city as well. But Alexandria then gets re-annexed back to Virginia in 1846. During contemporary reports of Lafayette's visit, Alexandria sometimes gets looped in with DC reporting because it is within the District of Columbia. There's also nice added confusion of Gadsby's Tavern. In 1824, Horatio Claggett was the one that operated what we know today as Gadsby's. At the time, it was called City Hotel. And while at the same time in 1824, John Gadsby was operating a hotel in Washington, D.C. proper. So it gets a little confusing in contemporary accounts of like where Lafayette was if he was in Alexandria, but thankfully we know now when he was in Alexandria, and he visited 3 times during his 1824-1825 tour. But he also visited Alexandria even prior to 1824. In April of 1781, Lafayette passed through Alexandria on the way to Yorktown, and he writes this wonderful letter to Thomas Jefferson, who was the governor at the time, apologizing for the need to obtain wagons and cattle. He had to steal some wagons and cattle on his way down. He apologizes to the state of Virginia for having to have done it, but he was recognizing that as he was coming south, people were hiding their wagons and their cattle from the army, because at this point the war had gone on for almost 10 years and people were trying to like maintain their livelihoods. So That's what he knew Alexandria from in 1781. He does come back in 1784 during that brief kind of visit he has, that short tour. He spends about 2 weeks at Mount Vernon during this time period. And during one of those, a period of those 2 weeks, he and Washington actually dined at Lomax's Tavern, which was located on Princess Street. During his national tour, Lafayette first visited Alexandria on October 16th, 1824. This is a 1920s depiction of Lafayette's arrival. There was a procession. It didn't really look much like how we see it in the image here, but there was a large procession along with a dinner at City Hotel at Gadsby's Tavern. And the house that is depicted in this image is likely meant to be the house that Lafayette stayed in Alexandria during his October visit, which is the Lauriston House. This is located on St. Asaph and Duke Street, right on the corner there. It belonged to a woman named Elizabeth Lauriston. It was originally constructed for her husband, Thomas, who was a merchant here in Alexandria. And it's just a really fine example of federal style homes, which we have fortunate to have a lot of here in the city of Alexandria. It was considered to be one of the finest homes in the city, which was important because once the city learned that Lafayette would be visiting, he would be staying one night, the honor of who was going to host him became a matter that was so serious that it made it all its way to the city council, where it was decided on, and Mrs. Lauriston's home was chosen for how grand and beautiful that it was. To give Lafayette and his traveling party privacy, Mrs. Lauriston moved out for nearly the entire month of October. I mentioned Lafayette was only staying for just one night, but just in case he wanted to come back anytime, she graciously moved out and moved in with a family member nearby. And for her hospitality and service, the city awarded Mrs. Lauriston with a silver cup for her role in hosting the nation's guest. Now, in the winter of 1824-1825, I mentioned that Lafayette is really staying put in Washington, D.C. He is not really traveling that much. He's visiting a couple places nearby, but for the most part, he's staying in this area. There's a couple of reasons for this. The biggest reason is that winter weather makes travel a lot more difficult. Lafayette was 67 years old at this time. He had suffered numerous leg injuries in his past, and getting around was not easy. He was really kind of reserved to traveling to stagecoach. He was not able to ride a horse at this time period. Stagecoach is not very comfortable when you kind of think of the road situation. It's nowhere near the interstates that we have here, for better or for worse, we might think. But so getting around in stagecoach was really cumbersome. So taking the winter kind of off and spending like it in a central place was really convenient for him. It also gave him the opportunity to have a little bit of fun. Not saying that visiting a different city almost every day isn't fun, but Lafayette was able to settle down. He went to a ton of dinners during this time period. He went to the theater. He went to operas a lot. And he was visiting a lot of friends who lived nearby, the Custis grandchildren, who were Martha Washington's grandchildren from her first marriage. They all pretty much lived right in the DC area. He's spending a lot of time with them, with his connection to Washington, and he goes on a lot of little side trips to local areas. He spends a little bit of time in Annapolis. He goes to Baltimore. He goes to Richmond. He goes out to Frederick, Maryland as well, and he goes back to Alexandria. So on December 14th, 1824, Lafayette stopped in Alexandria for a really, really brief trip. He was on his way on his way back to DC from Mount Vernon, and he stopped in to meet with Anne Hill Carter Lee, the widow of General Henry Lee, at her home on Oronoco Street. Newspapers reported this stop as a quote flying visit, which meant that Lafayette was not really giving much notice of that he was going to stop by here in Alexandria. He was truly just going to see Mrs. Lee. He definitely knew at this point that if towns got advance notice of where he was going to be, they were really going to stop things. He tries to travel even incognito to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and on his way there, someone from York, Pennsylvania, recognized him and went back home to York and said, Lafayette's like, he's on his way to Harrisburg. If he's coming back to DC, he's going to have to pass through us in York. Let's throw a party. And then he's in York for about 2 days. So he's definitely aware, trying to travel as incognito as possible. Also, during this brief visit that he had with Mrs. Lee, it was likely that her son, Robert E. Lee, would have also been in attendance too. But there was one other trip to the city of Alexandria, one kind of more formal trip that happens during this time period. And this happens on February 21st, 1825, just 200 years and a couple days ago. This was when he returned to the city of Alexandria to attend a Masonic banquet, which was held in honor of Washington's birthday. This visit was first arranged and proposed during Lafayette's previous visit to Alexandria in October, and it took place at the Alexandria Washington Lodge's rooms, which were then located at City Hall. Lafayette was a Mason. He was a Freemason, although it's debated if he became a member in France or in the United States, but it is known that he was a member. There are more than 75 Masonic bodies in the United States that have been named after Lafayette, and the Alexandria Washington Lodge was the very first lodge in the city of Alexandria. And it's one of the oldest lodges in the Commonwealth of Virginia as well, and Washington himself was an honorary member in his lifetime. Today, the Masonic Lodge is still in existence, but it's located all the way down the street on King Street, and it's better known as the Washington Masonic Memorial. It's this massive, massive building. But at the time of Lafayette's visit, the lodge was housed in City Hall, and this is the original City Hall that we can see on the screen here. The visit was a pretty short one. Lafayette arrives at City Hall with his secretary, Auguste Levasseur, at 4 o'clock. He crosses Royal Street, heads into the lodge, and after a traditional Masonic reception, wherein Lafayette also addressed the group then had another procession back across the street to City Hotel, today Gadsby's Tavern. Unlike Lafayette's previous reception at City Hotel, which happened in that previous October, this dinner was not open to the public. It was just for Freemasons only. There were a plethora of toasts. If you go through newspaper accounts of Lafayette's tour, fortunately for newspaper accounts in the 19th century, it's a little bit different than like reporting in newspapers today. Newspapers today were kind of used to like more storytelling and more kind of like spin and things like that. Newspapers in the 19th century are going to tell you who was there, what was said, sometimes what they ate. And it's a lot more, for historian wise, like really helpful in kind of knowing what was going on. There were about 34 toasts that were given, which were all printed. What each toast said was printed in the newspaper. So even if you weren't invited to this dinner, you could still know what was said during it. And then after a meal was served. I mentioned Lafayette only arrived at 4 p.m. and by 8 o'clock, he excused himself, expressing a great regret of having to depart back to Washington, and that he hoped to return to Alexandria. But he did not return for any other formal visits during the tour. Shortly after Lafayette had this reception for the Masonic reception in Alexandria, he then departs on a southern tour of the United States, going all throughout the southern states, and then he doesn't really come back to Washington until the summer, where he does then depart from America and heads back to France in early September of 1825. If you have not ever visited the Washington Masonic Memorial, I would highly recommend it. They have several items related to Lafayette, including his Masonic connection, as well as his 1825 visit on display at their museum. And I would highly recommend it. And then you can go to the rooftop and see the beautiful the views of the city and of Washington as well. Another aspect that's really interesting, kind of another Alexandria connection, are these souvenirs that are produced in the wake of Lafayette's visit. When cities knew that Lafayette was arriving, and Alexandria is no exception from this, shopkeepers would take out ads and they would advertise Lafayette-related souvenirs that were available for purchase. On King Street, there were numerous shopkeepers that were selling Lafayette-related items. J.H. Runney's Hat and Fancy Store on King Street was offering Lafayette badges, kind of like a ribbon for sale that you could wear. And Robert H. Miller on King Street was offering china cups and saucers, tea plates, snuff boxes, imitation china pitchers, mugs, bowls, pitchers with Lafayette, the surrender of Cornwallis, Yorktown imagery of Washington as well, that proved to be so popular that in March of 1826, like years later, he's offering another further supply of Lafayette ware, along with tea sets, gold edge, and view of Mount Vernon. These items were so deeply popular because what Americans were really looking for, which we kind of understand today, is like a physical memory of a major event. We see this a lot with like musical artists and pop culture of the concept of getting merch. We're not so different than Americans 200 years ago, who were still very much doing the same thing. You can see a couple examples of Lafayette-related items that you could get here. There are pitchers, glassware, a fan. The gloves are an especially unique one. Lots of young ladies would wear gloves with Lafayette's face, and if they had the opportunity to meet him and you would politely offer your hand for him to kiss, he would make a joke that he did not want to kiss his own face. On the side of the screen, there's also a screenshot from the Salem Gazette, which was published in October of 1824, saying that everything is Lafayette, whether it be on our heads or under our feet. We wrap our bodies in Lafayette coats during the day and repose between Lafayette blankets at night. We have Lafayette bread, Lafayette butter, Lafayette beef, Lafayette vegetables, and every description from the common turnip radish to the most dainty dish of celery, together with various other Lafayette articles too tedious to mention. Even the ladies distinguish their proper from common kisses under the title of Lafayette smooches, which is such a lovely humanistic way of kind of describing this craziness that was happening. What I really enjoy about these souvenirs is that it provides this connection between generations, between genders. Like none of these items are there are some items that are specifically meant for a target audience, but there were items for everyone. Getting a Lafayette souvenir did not mean you just have to be a young lady or you had to be a child or you had to be a man. There was something for everyone. And the fact that so many of these items still survive. Thanks to the bicentennial that's going on, a lot of these items are going on display. And when you think about the amount of items that were just made and also preserved, you can really get the sense of what this figure meant to Americans at the time, what it meant for the family members and the descendants who held on to these items, and what it means to Americans today. And that's kind of something that connects us through history as well. One of my another favorite Lafayette kind of ism that happens during this time period is one of Alexandria's own residents, Benjamin Hallowell. He had gotten married shortly before Lafayette's visit, and he wrote a poem to commemorate this event, this national event that's happening. And he even mentions these souvenirs in his poem, and he says that each lover of liberty surely must get something in honor of Lafayette. There's a Lafayette watch chain and a Lafayette hat, a Lafayette this and a Lafayette that. But I wanted something as lasting as life, and I took to myself a Lafayette wife, which is a very clever rhyme and kind of good way of sort of describing this. There are other aspects of Lafayette. People connected with him and more so than just kind of wanting his face on gloves or pottery or things like that. But really what he stood for really spoke to Americans. A massive thing that's happening in the United States during this time period is, of course, the institution of slavery is deeply prevalent throughout the United States. It's also deeply prevalent here in Alexandria. This is an image of Franklin and Armfield, and Franklin and Armfield was one of the largest slave trading organizations that operated here. It operated here in Alexandria, but it was one of the largest in the nation. In the 19th century, Alexandria was also one of the largest domestic slave trading ports in America. And Lafayette was vehemently opposed to the institution of slavery and spent the majority of his adult career trying to hasten the end of the practice. And not only just saying that it was wrong, but trying to come up with solutions on how to end it. During his tour, Lafayette was really aware that he had this bipartisan popularity. He was a really unique figure in a divisive nation where he did not belong to a political party. Americans kind of claimed him collectively as their own. They did not see him as like a member of a certain political party or not. They saw him collectively as kind of American. And so he had this ability to bring people together. And I think you can really see that in the friends that he kept. He was very close friends with Thomas Jefferson. He was very close friends with Alexander Hamilton. Not many people can say that they were close friends with both of those men, but Lafayette could. And so he knew that he had this kind of impact on Americans, and he uses that advantage to subvert social norms, especially when it comes to the institution of slavery. Um, Throughout his personal correspondence and his public appearance during the national tour, he frequently goes out of his way to acknowledge free and enslaved men who he had known from his previous time in America. And although there's no instances of this happening in Alexandria, there are instances of this happening in Virginia. One of these happens with this man who we see on the screen. His name is James Armistead Lafayette. James was a enslaved man who served as a spy, as a double agent to the benefit of the Americans during the American Revolution and during the Battle of Yorktown. He would feed the British false information and relay that intelligence back to Lafayette. And it was thanks to the intelligence that James received that Lafayette was able to hear about the approaching British warships and was able to help secure a blockade at Yorktown, which eventually brought about the end of the war. With the passage of the Act of 1783 in Virginia, that meant that all enslaved men who had served in combat would be eligible for their freedom. James went to apply. He found out that he was not eligible because his service was through espionage. It was not through combat. And so Lafayette hears about this when he comes back in 1784, and he personally petitions for James's freedom. And you can see on the right-hand side of the screen a facsimile of James's portrait, and as well as Lafayette's testimony, basically saying, "This is to certify that the bearer by the name of James has done essential services to me while I had the honor to command in this state." At the end, it says, he seems perfectly acquitted to the reward, every reward his situation can admit of, done under my hand, Richmond, November of 1784, signed Lafayette. Lafayette publicly coming to James's aid is what's going to end up helping him win his emancipation in 1787. And the two men were reunited in October of 1824. In southeastern Virginia. Lafayette arrived and he saw James in the crowd. He ordered the carriage to stop, and the two men publicly embraced in the midst of the crowd, which was majority white crowd. Lafayette was very aware of what he was doing by publicly embracing his friend. After James earns his emancipation in 1787, he adds the Lafayette as a surname. His name was James Armistead, and then he went by Lafayette, or you'll sometimes see James Armistead Fayette as a name after 1787. There are a couple other examples of Lafayette doing similar kind of actions. Another one happens in Monticello. He is overheard really pestering Thomas Jefferson, kind of saying, like, "You wrote this amazing document for all men are created equal, yet you hold so many people in bondage. Don't you think that that is kind of in like direct conflict in what we fought this war over?" And the reason we know that these two men had these conversations is because they were overheard by an enslaved man at Monticello. His name was Israel Jefferson, who was driving the carriage. This happened on a carriage ride from Monticello to the University of Virginia that Lafayette and Jefferson were making. And he was interviewed about this like 40 years after this event happened. And he said that he always remembered how kind of Lafayette stood up to him, and how even, but still speaking respectfully as it was his friend, but how he was the only person that he had witnessed have that conversation with Jefferson. In New Orleans, he requests an audience with Black veterans of the War of 1812. When he was told that that was not able to happen, he made sure that it did. He didn't like take this opportunity as the nation's guest and as this on his tour to lecture the public on kind of America's moral shortcomings, but he does this in a subtle way that subverts the social rules, and he's openly welcoming people that were excluded. He didn't condemn people who disagreed with him. Instead, he encourages conversation, and he really used his celebrity during this tour to advance the cause of America's original purpose, which was a freely elected and representative government for all people. He does not just do this with people who were enslaved or formerly enslaved or were enslaved. He crosses gender and class lines as well. In Concord, Massachusetts, there were a group of farmers and mechanics who protested because they had been turned away from an event with Lafayette in favor of more wealthy and elite members of the town. Lafayette hears about this, and he meets with them. In New Haven, Connecticut, another similar instance, a group of women were barred from a breakfast event with Lafayette on the basis of their gender. Lafayette said no, and he welcomed them in as well. So he saw these barriers that were happening, and he recognized that he was someone that could help kind of break down those barriers through this position that he had. These collective moments, they don't see radical change in America. We may notice that this is 1824. A couple decades later, a civil war is going to break out, but it's going to help birth this collective action that drives the rest of the 19th century. We see this through labor unions, social reforms, and women's suffrage as well. The echoes of Lafayette are in a lot of those movements. So where is Lafayette at Alexandria today? Well, we see him around quite a bit. These are a couple physical examples of Lafayette. Fayette Street was named after him. It was actually named after him before the tour in the 1780s after his like mini tour that happened in 1784. The Larison House that he stayed in has a plaque on the side. It's marking that its significance and playing host to the nation's guest. And today it's more colloquially known as the Lafayette House. And one of the most recent additions is right next to the Lafayette House is this beautiful wayfinding sign that talks a lot about Lafayette's time in Alexandria during his tour and the impact he had on the city. Lafayette also continued to have this lingering influence as well. Gadsby's Tavern was saved largely due to its significance in hosting Lafayette for dinner during his national tour as well. So he continues to have a presence, even though he may have only slept here for one night. But Lafayette continues to have this really long legacy in America. He is a name that is known because of this national tour that happens, and he becomes this more elevated figure in American history and kind of a really expansive figure in American history. He ends up becoming more beloved here than in his native country of France. And a big part of the reason why Lafayette is still loved and beloved is the fact that there's this prevalence of youth that happens on his tour. Children are involved in these ceremonies and presentations. I mentioned earlier, Lafayette is the last surviving major general of the American Revolution. It's just kind of a similar situation where we see many of the veterans of World War I have passed on. Americans were in a similar situation in 1824, but it was for the memories of the American Revolution. So a lot of people who had seen him on the tour, a lot of children who'd seen him on the tour, had this physical memory of him that they pass on to their children and their children's children. We see this also in the form of namesakes. We have Fayette Street here in Alexandria. There are so many streets and towns named after Lafayette. There's college named after Lafayette. You can see the emblem of Lafayette College in the center of the screen here. We also have the spike in baby names of Lafayette that happens after the tour, people naming their sons, sometimes even their daughters, after him as well. And we still continue to see that today. Lafayette is really, really prevalent in popular culture. On the left side of the screen, I've shown some like pop culture adaptations of him, at least through visual media. You have, he showed up as a character in the Benjamin Franklin miniseries. He was a character in the TV show Turn, of course, the musical Hamilton, and Liberty's Kids as well. He's a major player in all those. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, we see some other different namesakes for Lafayette, including Lafayette College, which was named after him. There is a stock for Lafayette Motor Company. The image of Jackie Kennedy, she is christening the USS Lafayette, which was a ballistic missile submarine that was launched in the 1960s. We see him shaking hands with Uncle Sam in a World War I recruitment poster. And then at the bottom of the screen, women's suffrage. These are members of the National Women's Party protesting their right to vote at the base of the Lafayette statue in Lafayette Park in Washington, D.C. And you can kind of see it kind of like the base where it says you can see General Lafayette. Unfortunately, his actual statue is not in the picture, but they chose to specifically protest at the base of his statue for what he had stood for and human rights and equality. So as we kind of are wrapping up, we're entering the end of the bicentennial year. We have a couple more months with Lafayette before he returns back to France. I think it might be a little obvious that we are missing a sort of Lafayette-like figure these days, someone that has this ability to kind of represent all of America, has the ability to reach across party lines, and is universally adored and welcomed. So As we spend the rest of this year celebrating Lafayette's value and his passion and celebrity, I urge each and every one of us who are gathered in this virtual space tonight to reflect on this final question. How can those of us who are inspired by Lafayette's words and actions be the ones to continue his work today? Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you, Elizabeth. And we have a couple questions in the chat, so we'll get to those for anyone else. If you have a question, put it in the chat, and we've got a good amount of time, so we should be able to get to it. The first question, there's actually a question that I can answer, and yes, this will be posted later on our YouTube channel. So if you want to take a look at one of the images on the PowerPoint, or you want to re-listen to a section of that, you will be able to do that. So turning to questions that, Elizabeth, you're in a much better position than me to answer.
Perfect.
The first one is about kind of the bankruptcy of the French monarchy. So if you can talk a little bit more about that. I think it's referring to in the lead up to the French Revolution.
Yeah. I can. Is there a more specific question about the bankruptcy?
Can you hear me?
I can. Yes.
Thank you so much. I actually have one funny question, which is the one I posted, and a more serious question. So first, I was wondering, so after the American Revolution, when the American government decided to not pay the debt back to France, which led to the bankruptcy of French monarchy and then the French Revolution, but that debt is still there. Like, my funny question is, like, do you think in the future, maybe one day, the US will eventually think about, oh, that was great that France did that, like, and supported our independence and eventually pay back the debts? I don't know. Like, for that like, they have like an expiration date, so I don't know, like, if that would still be possible, especially considering right now in France we have this economic crisis going on. And the more serious question is, can you tell us a little bit more about George Washington's connection with Alexandria?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. In terms of if America will ever formally repay the debt that was paid during, or that was spent during the American Revolution, I cannot say. I have no authority in that matter, nor do I have any, as a historian, I have no way of predicting the future. So I'm not entirely sure about that. But in terms of George Washington's connection to Alexandria, yes, absolutely. Alexandria is very proud to say that we are Washington's adopted hometown. He may not have been born here, but he lived most of his life nearby. Mount Vernon is a hop, skip, and a jump away from the city of Alexandria. He owned property here in Alexandria. He had many friends here. He visited frequently. He went to Gadsby's multiple times, including to celebrate his birthday, the birth night ball, and he also sent people to help sell his own produce that was grown at Mount Vernon at the farmers market, which still happens every Saturday morning. So you cannot go anywhere in Alexandria without having a kind of a Washington slept here moment, so to speak. But yes, good questions.
So the next question is another one that relates to Lafayette's life, but not so much the national tour. But we got a question. They want to know more about Lafayette's experiment on emancipation.
Yes,
that he carried out. Yes.
Awesome. I love this question. I always try to fit it in. Sometimes it doesn't really fit. So I'm very grateful that you asked this question about Lafayette's experiment. So Lafayette, prior to his imprisonment, he had this idea for gradual emancipation. It's called the Cayenne experiments. What he does is he buys several plantations in French Guiana, and with the intention that the people that he enslaved them, he was a slave owner by doing this, but his intention was that he could show that an agricultural society could exist without the need for slavery, and to show this, that everyone was educated, there was no corporal punishment. Any punishment that was given would have been the same regardless of race, white workers or black workers, and people were paid. He was really, really excited about this experiment. He writes to George Washington saying, like, I have this amazing idea. We can work on this together. We can bring about the end of slavery here in the United States. And Washington, in his very kind of Washington way, writes, we'll talk about this more when I see you. So I can imagine that these conversations that Washington and Lafayette had during Lafayette's 1784 visit were largely about this. Unfortunately, it's neither succeeds or fails, so to speak, because when Lafayette is in prison during the French Revolution, his property is seized. So unfortunately, the people who were under the Cayenne experiment system were then re-enslaved. I know there is some research being done about the lives of these specific people. I think there's about 70 people that were enslaved at Lafayette, so with his Cayenne experiments. And I know there's still a lot more that we can like learn about them, and especially through descendant work as well. So I'm excited to see what comes out of that. It's a good thing about studying history, is that you never, like, there's always more to find out. What I really appreciate about Lafayette in this with the Cayenne experiment specifically is that it shows that he was willing to do the research, walk the walk, and talk the talk. Like you see a lot of his contemporaries, a lot of his friends even saying like, this is a problem for a future generation. We cannot deal with it now. And Lafayette is kind of in the reverse, saying, this is something we can deal with right now. And I have a solution. Let's give it a shot, which really stands out. And I think it's one of the reasons why he kind of ages into the 21st century a little bit differently than the men he was friends with, but it what makes him really special too.
So the next question we have relates to Lafayette's traveling companion during his national tour, his son, who had a name that very much reflects Washington's closeness with George Washington. Can you talk a little bit about Lafayette's son, his story, and his experiences during the national tour?
Yeah, Lafayette's son, his name was George Washington Lafayette. This was not his first time in America. During the French Revolution, Adrienne had the foresight of recognizing that her husband was in prison. Her family was a target. Her son was very much going to be a target as the only son of Lafayette. So she sends him to America, essentially kind of like with like note pinned to his chest, and trying to get him to Washington. He lives with the Hamiltons for a little bit, and then he ends up living with George Washington in Philadelphia when he's president. And then when the presidency is over, he lives at Mount Vernon with the Washingtons as well. So he was here for about 2 years during the French Revolution. So he had gotten to know the Washington family as well. So he returns with his father when Lafayette comes back in 1824, and he had friends here. He went to Harvard during his time here during the French Revolution. So he had a social system. He is not constantly traveling with his father. He wasn't at the Mason event with his father that Levasseur joined in. He's visiting other friends as well. He was very close with Nellie Custis, and he spent a lot of time at Woodlawn, which is pretty cool because that's where I work. And so we have a lot of correspondence between the two, and they had a very close friendship. They were only a couple months apart. Yeah, he was traveling with his father, but it's unique because he had his own experiences of America too. It wasn't just like I'm with my dad who's like being celebrated. Like, he also had relationships with people. There aren't any kind of like, besides his own personal correspondence, he doesn't like publish anything about his experience being in America during this time period. But Lafayette's other companion, his private secretary, Auguste Levasseur, he actually keeps a journal of his time in America. And that was the intention, that journal would go back to France and kind of be a little bit of a PR campaign for Lafayette in France. They have since been translated into English. They're online, you can get them for free. So if you would like to learn kind of about Lafayette's experience through the perspective of the man who was traveling with him pretty much the entire time, I would highly recommend that.
So we've got another question. After Lafayette left in 1825, did he have any further correspondence with anyone in the United States?
Oh, yes. Yes. He was writing letters to his friends here in America until he passed away. He made new friends along this journey. He has a series of correspondence with a young woman named Eliza Ridgely. She was from a Baltimore family, and they keep up a correspondence until he dies in 1834. And he maintains all his correspondence. The difficult thing is that there's no like, because he's not president, there's no like Lafayette Presidential Library. So these letters are a little bit scattered. There are the Lafayette papers, they have been microfilmed. A lot of the Lafayette papers, at least that were at his home in France, they were microfilmed by the Library of Congress in the 1990s. And those are all accessible at the Library of Congress, which you can just request to see them. And I use them in my research as well. So yeah, lots of letters are still around from that like 10-year period after the tour and before he passes away.
So the next one, the questioner asks, have you read The Women of Chateau Lafayette? They said they loved it, but they would like to know a historian's view.
I have read it. I do love it. I very much enjoy that author, Stephanie Dray. I think she writes wonderful historical fiction. I'm the type of historian who I can take off like my work hat when I read historical fiction or watch like history kind of like television and stuff and just appreciate it for what it is. But I really do. The research that she puts into her books is exhaustive but still in a way that like brings life into these characters. Like you're not feeling like you're reading a textbook. You're really being entertained, but you're also learning more. I think the best measure of historical fiction is if it makes you want to read like more about the figure that it's about, then it's done its job really well, at least in my view. And I think her books do that as well. I think it's a beautiful story. The Women of Chateau Lafayette is not just about Adrienne. It's about like the Chateau Lafayette. It's about the house and like what happens through the house in World War I and World War II. So it kind of is this like interconnected story if you haven't read it. Probably one of my favorite Lafayette themed historical fictions, I would say.
All right, perfect. So we're getting close to end of time. I have one quick question. So you talked about Lafayette visiting Monticello and having that conversation with Jefferson about you wrote all men are created equal, but why are you still enslaving other people? Do we have any evidence of Lafayette when he was visiting Mount Vernon or when he was visiting Arlington House, having similar conversations with Bushrod Washington or George Washington Parke Custis of, hey, you're part of this legacy. Why aren't you, taking action to free the people you're enslaved?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the one that immediately strikes out to me is the Jefferson one because it's so, that one's a lot more just ingrained of what it was. But George Washington Parke Custis writes a series of like newspaper articles. Essentially, it's like talking about like Lafayette and his relationship with Lafayette, especially during the tour. What's interesting about George Washington Parke Custis is like he is clearly very inspired by Lafayette's personal views and society and like civil rights views. He kind of goes in an opposite direction. For a little bit, he becomes a member of the American Colonization Society, which was a society that was for people who were of African descent to be sent to a colony in Africa. He is pretty impassioned about this idea that he thinks that's the way to go. But we see after Lafayette leaves that he has a shift in his thinking, and he also in his will says that like anyone that is enslaved, that he has enslaved, is to be freed no later than, I think it's like 4 or 5 years after his death, but they must be freed. And it ends up being his son-in-law, Robert E. Lee, who has to like formally go with the courts to free that. I would imagine they would have had conversations. The difficult thing though, and the reason why the Monticello one is so documented too, is because it was overheard, and sometimes there are the private conversations. I see in the chat, Roberta, yeah, like I think it's I just can't think of it specifically off the top of my head, but yes, I believe that George Washington Parke Custis writes about this in his memoirs later. I don't think there's Lafayette didn't really have a relationship with Bushrod Washington. Poor Bushrod Washington kind of gets the short end of the stick, but I don't know if he had like any sort of conversations with him. I know he didn't really he had much more of a closeness with the Custises, so I think he'd be more comfortable talking to them.
Got it. No, thank you. All right. So again, thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing your expertise and your knowledge with us. Thank you for everyone who joined us. The Alexandria Historical Society, we do events and programs throughout the year. Our next event is going to be in person at the Lyceum on Wednesday, March 26th. John Rand will be giving a lecture, George Mason and the 10th Amendment. So the past couple Zoom lectures we've done, it has been freezing cold outside. Today, it was beautiful. It was sunny. So we're getting ready to the point where we're meeting in person again. So definitely, if you're interested in hearing more about the work we do, hearing and attending our lectures, our history events, our behind the scenes experiences, please check out our website. I'm going to drop it in the chat. And definitely consider signing up for a membership. We are a nonprofit organization, so all the funds we have for all of our activities come from donations and support of our members. So again, thank you everyone for participating tonight. Thank you again, Elizabeth. And can't wait to see, you've written one Lafayette book. Can't wait to see what your next book is going to be about. And we look forward to inviting you back once that book comes out.
Thank you so much.
Great. All right. Well, thanks again, everyone, and have a great evening.